So today I want to talk about two periodicals. The little magazine Zenit from the Balkans and the Soviet illustrated magazine USSR under construction. I want to talk about them as discursive sites, testing the affordances and challenges of this concept and how it can influence the periodical studies in large. So let me first outline the larger methodological framework within which my argument is formed. In his seminal 2015 editorial titled "What is Modern Periodical Studies?", Patrick Collier states that periodicals have been discussed as broader object of knowledge within larger cultural fields to which periodical is said to give us access. In order to suggest going beyond research into how both literary and periodical form make imaginative writing into something that should organize our experience and make meaning. Collier proposes that we should examine who is benefiting from such organization of experience and meaning making, as well as how periodical form enables and perpetuates or undermines and subverts such power relations. He finally calls to start treating the periodical as an autonomous object of study to the greatest degree possible, starting out without having decided in advance where our periodical's value lies. As sites of linguistic and visual representation, periodicals are discursive sites, locations from which discourse emanate, and places that include other discursive sites such as bodies, institutional positions, built environments, etc. They are, as the authors of the JAP's 2016 editorial state, a key site for cultural production, public debate, and dissemination of knowledge. As discursive sites, periodicals form emotional community, and as the editors of JAP's 2017 editorial put it, function as platforms for social critique and political engagement, being central vehicles in negotiating the battle over cultural hegemony. When we talk about periodicals as discursive sites in relation to the socio-spatial constructs such as center and periphery, as the binary pairs vested with the imbalance of power, we are reminded of Lefebvre's concept of social space, which points to the indivisibility of space and social power. It is untenable to conceive of social relations of class, gender, race, or nation as falling outside of the purview of the speciality through which they are practiced and reproduced for everyday life. The analysis of representation is a thoroughly spatial task. It falls on all sides of an analytic that specifies its communication in terms of production, content, and reception. And all of these, in turn, are interconnected through myriad spatial contexts that ultimately unhinge these analytics limits. The task of sampling and comparing a 1920s little magazine from the European periphery, such as Yugoslav Zenit, and the USSR in construction, a 1930s illustrated magazine from Moscow as a new ideological center, may look as a daunting, if not silly task of comparing apples and oranges. But my goal is to cut through what they have in common, through the fact that as periodicals, they're both fruits of cultural capital, which always depends on and creates space, as Bourdieu's notions of spatial capital have it. I want to show first how both of these periodicals are different in regard to their production, content or genre, and reception. And second, I want to argue for the importance of a space where these discursive sites come together as similar, and where the periodical as a space can be seen as a mental construction generating new definitions and ideas. Finally, my aim is to treat the periodical as an autonomous object of study to the greatest degree possible, to return to Patrick Collier's point from the beginning of my talk. I demonstrate that if we, following Collier, start without having decided in advance where our periodical's value lies, we are certainly to arrive to the centrality of the value question. So let me begin. I'll talk about production first. So Zenit, magazine Zenit was some sort of family business. It was conceived as an international review in 1921 in Zagreb by the artist couple, Ljubomir Micic, who was a poet, critic, writer of manifestos, and editor-in-chief of the magazine, and his wife, Anushka Micic, as well as his brother, younger brother, Branko Vepoljanski. Anushka's managerial and organizational role actually was paramount. Without her, the printing of this magazine would be impossible. Due to her connections to her uncle, who owned the factory Lipa Mill in Zagreb that produced cigarette papers, cardboard, and all paper products. She ran the Belgrade branch of this factory, and due to her connections, it was possible actually to print Zenit. Zenit was actually published from leftover paper that Anushka managed to set aside from the large quantity that passed through the branch office, which resulted in the issues being of different format, weight, and color. So when you look through the journal, it definitely shows you this diverse, even paper color. So Anushka's input was crucial, and she combined two important spheres, finance and culture, or in modern jargon, advertising, which was presented in every Zenit journal at the last pages or the inside of the covers. So it is in this broader economic context that the real picture of Zenitist production is obtained. This means that one of the most important anarchist and anti-capitalist literary journal of that time in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, or Kingdom of Yugoslavia, appeared in the heart of capitalist production. And besides Anushka, Micic's younger brother, Branko Vepoljanski, played another significant role because he provided a valuable support both in the work of the magazine and also promoting Zenitism in the European cities such as Vienna, Prague, Berlin, Paris, as well as in Yugoslav cities, Ljubljana, Zagreb, and Belgrade. If Zenit appeared to be a family business, it was a family with the distant relatives. These so-called distant relatives were Boško Tokin, a Serbian Yugoslav publicist and cinephile, and Ivan Gol, a French-German poet living in Paris. Both started contributing to Zenit from the first issue, formally joined Zenitism, accepted its program, and contributed to its formation and promotion. Two of them, together with Ljubomir Micic, also signed the Manifesto of Zenitism in 1921, and Gol even joined Zenit as a co-editor for Western Europe and ran it with Micic from October 21 to May 1922, embracing this East-West editorial concept. Besides Ivan Gol, who served as one of the initial pillars of Zenitism, many renewed Yugoslav and European avant-garde artists appeared in the pages of Zenit. And this is the image from the last issue that lists many of them, if not all. Internationally, in its scope and ideology, Zenit established links to other avant-garde movements throughout the content beckoning international contributors. Micic also, I should mention, founded Zenitist press, Biblioteka Zenit, which was published around a dozen of chapbooks, Zenitist chapbooks, which included poetry collections, novels, experimental prose, and conceptual writing. And Zenit magazine, I would argue, cannot be viewed separately from these editions from Biblioteka Zenit press. In terms of USSR in construction, we are dealing with actually Soviet state-sponsored projects, so it's a completely different story than Zenit. It was initially conceived as an illustrated supplement of Naši dostiženja, or Our Achievements, a popular literary magazine that was founded by Maxim Gorky and published by the State Publishing House. Naši dostiženja was a magazine with the aim of educating Soviet peasants and workers, while USSR in construction was founded and launched primarily to be internationally distributed. And this orientation towards foreign readership is also notable in the magazine's choice of one of their editors-in-chief, which was Georgi Pyatakov. Georgy Pyatakov was involved in all the Russian institutions. He was from early 1920s, a deputy head of State Planning Committee. He was a chairman of Supreme Council of National Economy of Soviet Union. He was also a Trotskyist. So because of that, he was expelled from the party and then again reinstated in 1929 in order to become in 1929, the same year, a chairman of the board of Soviet State Bank. So while the type of the sympathies of the foreign audience for the USSR in construction is not specified, Pyatakov's involvement in the matter indicates that financial consideration, foreign trade, were the initial motivation for the foreign distribution of USSR in construction. Besides Pyatakov, Yevgenia Yezhova was another editor. She was a Soviet publishing worker who was known for her friendship with many Soviet writers and critics. She was also wife of Nikolai Yezhov, who was, as many of you may know, head of the People's Commissariat of NKVD, or the Soviet Secret Police, which carried out the Stalinist terror later on. And these connections, I argue, are very important, of course. Another prominent association with this magazine is by the venerated writer Maxim Gorky, which you can see him here in an interesting company that is also telling. So it is in this broader economic context that a real picture of the late constructivist production is obtained. This means that the most important Soviet illustrated magazine of that time, that was aimed to appeal to capitalist reception, primary foreign readership, appeared in the heart of socialist production. It summoned the most progressive photo avant-garde artists in the Soviet Union in the service of the Soviet state and its centralized socialist construction. Here you can see a list of photographers that are now part of history of world photography, not only of Russian photography, as well as designers, famous and well-known avant-gardists. They were all involved in production of USSR in construction. Also, I would mention that all the visual strategies of the propaganda photo books designed by Lisitsky and Rodchenko, such as elaborate photo montages, innovative photography, graphic design, even fold-out pages, etc., they were all developed in this magazine, USSR in Construction, for which Martin Parr says it's one of the most beautifully produced magazines of the 20th century. And I'll switch now to the part which is the most important for my argument, right? I want to talk about genre in relating to these two magazines and their connection with this genre, whether they're coming from literature or from other arts, such as photography. So, although Zenit published work from most of the concurrent avant-garde movements sprouting up across Europe, it was the press that best highlighted what Zenitism made unique, namely hybrid writing. Though the Zenitists did not invent hybrid writing, they were first to make it a central feature of their poetics. Ljubomir Micic launched the provocative idea to undertake a Balkanization of Europe. Unlike the contemporary association of Balkanization as fragmentation along ethnic lines that arose from the breakup of socialist Yugoslavia, Micic sought in Balkanization the return of the repressed or the unconscious of Europe, which is the Balkans, to a fresh, primitive, and positive creative force of the awakened Barbarogenius who would conquer and rejuvenate tired European culture. So according to him, Europe cannot do that on their own. Europe needs fresh forces or new forces. The idea of barbarism and the incarnation of the Barbarogenius should be seen in light of the conflict between East and West, Moscow and Paris, because they reveal the sociological and political ideological positions of Zenitism. In Europe, Micic saw not only a sclerotic and tired culture eager for new juices and the need for rejuvenation, but also the economical and political base of imperialism and capitalism. In the Balkans, on the other hand, Micic saw, or more precisely projected, his own belief in the creative and transformative power of pure, original primitiveness and barbarism inherent as he saw it in the Balkan man. Moscow versus Paris was one of his battle cries. Orient versus Occident was one of the Barbarogenic ideologies. New, salvage, and fresh ideas versus old and overpassed European positions. Micic actually saw in Soviet Union an example of a successful social experiment by a Slavic people in what he called the Sea of the Latins, as the model of Slavic authenticity and originality which he suggested the Balkans should aspire to. And I want to show you this notion of hybridity even more so in just one example of Zenit manifest. On your left side you have the original, and on the right translation in English if you can read, probably not, but I'll try to explain. So in this manifesto, Micic offers an original version of the Balkanization of Europe with the barbarogenous as the central character. I'll quote, "We don't want to be Europeans, we are Balkans, Easterners. We want the Balkanization of Europe." And here in this manifesto we find the slogans East versus West and Moscow versus Paris, with which Micic betrays the earlier motto about dualistic relationship between East and West, or Orient and Occident, that he promoted through the co-editing with Ivan Gol. What I want you to pay attention is this manifesto's very form, or the space and layout, which coded this radical shift that I mentioned, introducing the orthography as a marker of difference. As art historians Glišić and Vujošević have argued, this manifesto is comprised of an outer layer of Latin character text surrounding the inner column of Cyrillic in various fonts and character weights. In the central column, we found an imaginary conversation that Micic has with Soviet leadership, Trotsky, Lenin, and Lunacharsky, who was the Minister of Education. They discuss whether Raskolnikov, the hero of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, was rightly killing the rapacious pawnbroker and stealing her money in order to use it for good effects, or not. And of course, as you can imagine, Micic was in favor of Raskolnikov's sections, thinking that they are positive and progressive, and equating them with the smashing of the skull of Western European capitalism and culture. In the outer layer of this Latin character text is interesting, I think, and I would argue, because in it, Micic began forging poetic self-awareness and articulating the cultural mission of Zenitism, in a dialogue, of course, with Europeans who called the Balkans barbarians. A critic, Radomir Konstantinović, remarked very aptly that the being of this Micic's barbarism cannot be separated from the language in which it is structured. So for him, it's very problematic that Micic tries to express authenticity in the language or Latin script that he found inauthentic. And I would argue that this is actually, we can turn this argument upside down and say that it is exactly in this outer column that Micic extends the limits of poetic language, opening it to what I call bastardizations with Esperanto, with cinema, with other forms of art, as well to interactions with visual features of the script, and promotes his concept of Zenitist hybrid writing. He writes, Zenitist poetry equals words in spades, words as meaning, the concept. It is, I would argue, in this unpremeditated promotion of hybridization and eclecticism that one should acknowledge the marriage between barbarity and geniality in the poet Barbarogenius, since the practice of bastardization, or the barbarism as culture, as a key tenet of cultural nihilism, consequently engendered Zenitism to foster hybrid genre and crossover genre such as cinepoetry or radio film or a machine-like march and even proto-conceptual writing. And why I mention this is important because in proto-conceptual writing that Zenitism develops, it is completely formed out of quotes, quoting from different sources, daily press, literary works, philosophy, economy, banking, and so forth. And in that way, undermining all the concepts of authenticity and originality upon which the Western European values are formed. When we talk about hybridity, we often talk about periphery, right? It is said that the peripheral geographical position of the region begot this belatedness in terms of development, and therefore in order to catch up they develop hybrid forms of art. And that's not only the case with the Balkans, but we can generally say with the Central Eastern European. I would say Zenithist hybridity, which is also evident in many avant-garde print culture of Central Eastern Europe, cannot simply be explained by the region's late reception of European trends or geographical position between East and West, nor by the linguistic obstacles that this position may entail. Insistence on hybridity and synthesis actually became a way to challenge the European West as the center of artistic production and to carve out a space for artists from this region in the history of art. And I would say that more importantly for the topic of this conference, as a little magazine published in the European periphery, Zenit could generate a fruitful deconstruction of Eurocentrism, not with the well-known and well-propagated concept of Balkanization of Europe, which is in itself problematic since it reproduces the structure of power it aims to undermine, but I argue through the practice of conceptual writing, enticing what I call literary banditry, appropriation, bastardization, barbarism as culture, that radically question the premises of authenticity, originality, and authorship upon which the notions of Western cultural values were established. And I'll go further and talk a little bit about Illustrated magazine. I'll have to skip a lot because of the time limits, so please bear with me. The concept of the new magazine may have initially been developed with Agonyek, which is a publishing company, under the aegis of chairman and editor Mikhail Kaltsov. Kaltsov was very important for periodicals, development of illustrated periodicals in Russia, in Soviet Russia. And he laid ground of modern photojournalism in Soviet Union. This journal was not alone in its influence of USSR in construction. There was also Novy Lev, which put forward the concept of art of the day and also promoted use of photography in cinema. Another journal I would say was important as is a predecessor of USSR in construction is Sovietskaya Kino, or Soviet cinema, which was designed by Rodchenko's wife, Maria Stepanova. She did covers, and she is important because of introduction of a new constructive layout for Illustrated magazine, which was clearly structured, which was, functional cover, separate headings like small architectonic blocks, which added to the standard system that the constructivists loved and made it so that while scrolling through the magazine, the eyes would notice the difference between the layout and feel this transition from one type of information to another, so that the page and the magazine would not be boring but dramatic and with a changing rhythm. In the depths of Agonyok, Mikhail Kaltsov formed the concept of photo edition that would be much more luxurious than the Agonyok magazine, and he approached Maxim Gorky and asked him, can we make a new magazine? And that's how they assembled the USSR in construction. The concept was simple. The journal should be about the process of Soviet industrialization and should be made exclusively from the documentary photography and film. There were actually, journal was printed in 4 different languages, so Russian, English, German, and French. This is English edition, the whole run Columbia University had, so I was lucky to make photos. And this is the editorial that clearly says in the middle that the state publishing house has chosen the photo as a method of illustrating socialist construction, for the photograph speaks much more convincingly in many cases than even the most brilliantly written articles. And I would just mention that the Russian version slightly differs with this editorial, adding to the photography the importance of cinema. And what you can find in this journal is it elevated the photo essay as a genre. So the photo essay is the form of photo series, or series of snapshots, observing the object from all points of view. As the genre, photo reportage or photo essay developed in the mid-1920s and became the main genre in the 1930s, when the storytelling with documentary photography finally fit into both ideological and propaganda frames. As Jindřich Thoman has shown, the 1920s and 30s transformed the picture essay into the photo essay. And I don't want to go into the detail in this discussion, but it basically, up to that point, photography produced single shots, and then photographers were aware of these limits, so they tried to develop a story and make a set or a series of photographs in order to solve this problem and turn it into a photo essay by using these entire sets of photographs that are organized along the time axis. In the presenting images sequentially, photo essays actually could instantiate their potential to tell the story and have a closure, right? And the photo essay obviously assumed filmic quality. The 1930s moved the photo essay from the environment of trivial entertainment to a grand causes of the period, right, which we'll have in the Soviet Union. And the first example I want to show you is done by two photographers that were working with USSR in construction closely, Max Alpert and Arkady Shaiket, but their photo essay was not published in Soviet Union, rather it was published in Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung in 1931. It's called 24 Hours in the Life of Moscow Working Class Family, and you know, it is following the story of individual members as an exemplary working class ladies who are, you know, going to industrial plant, working, going home, cooking, and doing all the roles that we are you know, that were associated with the women at the time, but also going and playing tennis and, you know, being oriented towards a more leisure time. This was the essay whose authenticity or truthfulness was questioned. So another iteration was published in Proletarskaya Photo, or Proletarian Photography in Russia, where the photographs and the sort of few people from Western Europe went to Moscow to meet these real people in order to get acquainted that the story is actually about real people. I'll just speed up and pay attention to one photo essay that I want to talk more in detail. Another example is Aleksandar Rodchenko's photo essay about the ambulance work, which gives you some sort of more dispersed quality of a narrative. And it's also self-reflexive, especially this image where you can see, you know, we gaze throughout the cockpit window into the street, but there are people on the street returning these gazes. So it's working a lot, this photo essay, about the gaze itself and its self-reflexive, in that way. The success of these essays, and especially Filipov's family essay, was prompting the creation of a number of photo series, among which the most resonating example I want to talk about now, and it's in the work of Max Alpert's The Giant and the Builder, devoted to the building of the iron and steel works in Magnitogorsk, the metallurgy complex in the Ural region of Russia. Or more precisely, to one of the participants in this building effort, worker Viktor Kalmykov. The entire photo series was being published in this magazine. It's USSR in Construction #1 from 1932. And later on, it was widely discussed in this magazine, Proletarskaya Photo. And that discussion is something I want to talk about a little bit as well. So the photographic and written narrative struck the work of Viktor Kalmykov. By taking the extraordinary opportunities afforded by the Soviet state. In a year and a half, our hero Kalmykov progresses from being a recently arrived illiterate manual laborer housed in a tent on a salary of 76 rubles per month. He advances to brigade leader and then on to constructor with his own private room and barracks and a salary of almost 300 rubles. He is taught to read and write as part of his technical training. He also gets married, and this is a romantic photograph of the marriage registration below. Kalmykov is awarded a bonus for his outstanding work, a new suit, and we are told that he wears the suit in his free time for visiting the theater, clubs, workers' club, or circus. And ultimately, Viktor is awarded the Order of Red Banner of Labor, and the story concludes. The life story of Viktor Kalmykov is one of tens of thousands just like that. A new man is entering the story. These people are engaged in the building of socialism. Every day brings more and more victories. New heroes are being born. The giant and the builder as a whole represents by itself one large staging. The main object of this staging is not only the story about our hero, but the time itself. The series was shot in 1 week, while on the level of its content, it covers actually a much longer period of a year and a half, if not more, during which the illiterate hero Kalmykov transforms into a worker, a shock worker, and a socialist constructor, building the new socialist reality, and also he develops into a communist. From the productionist view of productionists were a camp in Russia that were really sensitive on truthfulness, right, and authenticity. From their view, development of this material lacks documentary value and cannot serve as the source of true and necessary information about the redevelopment of the events. From the point of view of the main editor of Proletarskoye Photo, as well as the author of this photo essay, Max Alpert, what we deal here is something that they call method восставления факта, or the method of the reconstruction of the fact. The facts themselves, according to the author and the editors, are not fixed anymore. They are mendable, they are malleable, they are something that can be transformed from the point of view not of how and what, but for what, right? For what we are using this staging or this change of the facts. And instead of what we had in the 1920s with famous Viktor Shklovsky's or avant-garde laying bare the device, now in the 30s we have actually the masking of the device. And the whole discussion behind in Proletarskoye Photo about this type of narrative and this photo essay in particular was completely formed in the auspices of the discussion about socialist realism. Namely, the very form, the very storytelling has a reference to the literary prototype, and it suggests this chronological sequence of events even further buttress this analogy. And I want to just say a few things, and maybe I'll skip that, about the socialist realism in general, but what are the commonalities? I'll try to be succinct. We can read the giant and the builder in a different ways, like this title. For example, the giant can be a very building or very site, Magnitogorsk, so that the title would read the industrial site or the building and the builder. On the other hand, the giant and the builder read as the features of the main hero of the series, that is so-called the eidos of the proletariat, up to which this little man, peasant Kalmykov, gradually grows in the process of his participation in socialist building. And that fabula actually differs very little from one proposed by the proponents of socialist realism, right? It is the hero that goes through this dialectical process of becoming self-aware as a member of proletariat and someone who can contribute to the grand socialist project of building socialism. And I can go back to this if we have time in the discussion section, because there is much more to say about it. But I'll go forward just to give you a little taste of other examples. In 1933, Rodchenko joined the USSR in construction, and this is first author's number that he made. It is called In the White Sea Canal. And in 1935, he would start to work with Maria Stepanova in the same magazine. This is an interesting example because he's using color, deep printing, right? The magazine was done with the rotary press. And the color is the main information point, the method of highlighting the informational zones. What Rodchenko is using here further is the documentary material, such as telegrams, newspapers, material environment that allows you to immerse as a viewer in situation. This project in itself is problematic because it is about the penal colony. All these people are not voluntary there. They're serving their sentence and at the same time building the canal that was thought of as being very important, but actually didn't provide any benefits at the end of the day. Another important example of the USSR in construction that requires the whole new talk, but I'll just give you the gist of it, is the number about the parachute from 1935, also done together with Rodchenko and Stepanova. It introduces the fold-out layout, which was innovative at the time. It includes voluminous contributions to the fold-out illustration and reaching incredible height in terms of quality. At the very beginning, you have on the left side infographic, on the right side this famous Rodchenko's The Dive photography. He's again, sorry, using color. The layout is done by Stepanova. It's very dynamic, very experimental. Inside, you'll find also a story, a very simple photo essay story about a woman parachute who is, taking off with a plane, jumping, and successfully committing that task. And then she's greeted by the Soviet commissars and leaders and whatnot. And so that's the whole story. But inside the story, how it is done formally, it's very interesting because there is this triangle, right, that you can turn over on the page and fold it up, and it opens and shows you the sky and the leader, of course. It looks like a static film. It's very experimental, very dynamic, and this sequential viewing of the frames, I would argue, opens up a whole new dimension. There is this famous page that when you open, right, you get a parachute itself, and funny enough, Rodchenko and Stepanova both a parachute and bring it in their workshop and try to figure out, okay, how we can emulate this on the paper, right? And I didn't mention another important thing. This magazine was published in economic version and in the Lux version. So the Lux version of the same sort looked like this. And they really took their time to make this fold out. I would say this puts, as I said, another dimension that I cannot address today, but the fold outs is a very interesting topic in terms of illustrated magazines. And let me just make a little conclusion for this section. So if we concluded that the hybridization in terms of Zenit prompted this questioning of value, right? What we have here with the USSR, we have a genre such as photo essay, and especially the methodology of its genre, the methodology of phototale or photoraskaz in Russian, became the fundamental methodology for creating any illustrated magazine. And that's very important, I would say. Namely, the illustrated magazine is built on the same principle as the photo essay. So one genre actually dictates the kind of methodology for the entire publication. There are, of course, nuances because we can talk about, cropping photography, publishing it in different formats than the one that is taken. But generally, that's the main thing that remains, that the idea of a storytelling with the help of photography is the methodology for the illustrated magazine. Finally, this means that the central organizing principle for the illustrated magazine as a discursive site, that is a space where multiple discourses simultaneously take place, becomes time axis, a series and sequence around which the story is organized, and which is theological, that is, it has a narrative closure, a sort of character's accomplishment. So note that regardless whether we are talking about narrative time, historical time, a labor time, any notion of time, we time and again are pinpointing to the notion of value, and this is something I want to come back in the last section. So I'll talk about reception very briefly and try to wrap it up in a few minutes. I'll have to cut this down. So Zenit published text in original languages, and it inspired Emil Malespin, for example, to start a manometer in Lyon in 1922, which was a magazine modeled after Zenit. Who was the audience? Well, the audience were both international avant-garde artists, mainly living and working throughout Europe, and frequently contributing to Zenit, and the very few domestic readers, Yugoslav writers, contributors, and general audience. We can talk about Zenit inside the avant-garde network and outside the avant-garde network. What was the inside of avant-garde network? This publication, Nemo Profeta in Patria, is telling us, and it's basically showing how Zenit was known in Moscow, Paris, Leiden, Brussels, Antwerp, Milano, Berlin, and whatnot. But outside the network was Yugoslavia, right? In Yugoslavia, Zenit had a lot of problems. Zenit was actually, Micic himself was persecuted. He went on court. He suffered the state bans. And finally, Zenit was shut down because of the text Zenitism through the prism of Marxism. So he had to actually leave the country and spend 10 years in exile. You can imagine he didn't go in exile in Moscow. He spent it in Paris and France. In terms of USSR in construction, we are talking about multilingualism as imperialism, right? We have these different languages, but each issue is in printed in one language, right? One of these four languages, French, English, German, or Russian. It was one of the most expensive Soviet periodicals at the time. Who was the audience? Well, foreign audience, banks, industrial joint stocks, members of British Parliament, magazine and newspapers, politicians, literary figures, and so forth. So Soviet state actually needed the foreign investment to make trade. So they made this magazine as a segue or as a means to make that trade possible, to attract money, to actually attract investments, machines to develop. And then in 1934, already, they didn't need that money anymore. They had their own means, so the politics of the magazine changes, and it becomes actually the magazine for the new Soviet managerial elite. Of course, workers read it, but the magazine was so expensive that they could not probably afford it. They could go to a Rabochi club, you know, in the workers' club and read it there. And as I said, the deluxe editions were even more expensive and made for just, you know, elite of elite, I would say. So I'll just jump into a conclusion and wrap it up. What I want to say in both cases, USSR in construction and Zenit, when the context changes, of course, the discourse and representation of a discursive site will change. So the notion of a discursive community serves as a mechanism for both inclusion and exclusion, for networking and othering in both of these journals. And the final point I want to make is that the avant-garde periodicals, whether little journals or illustrated magazines, as much as the avant-garde art itself, raise the question of value as central, making it a neural center of the social network in which they are all equally participate as nodal points, regardless whether contributing from the geographic or cultural center or periphery. The question of value has a strong gravitational pull to turn a place where discourse happens into a center, or more precisely, to turn a discursive site into a nodal point of a social network, sometimes working against its peripheral geographic position or thereof lack of cultural capital as leverage. The discursive communities are formed around the shared notions of value, while the confrontations between different factions are caused by separate notions of shared values and with them connected structures of power. The values drive individuals and groups that are actively or passively participating in discourse sites, both to render and perceive periodicals as sites of contestation, as of domination.